So this is the second of 3 sessions in the Sustainable Agricultural Systems. And our first speaker, in case you were here to watch her speak, is not going to be here with us. So Nathan Mueller is going to kick it off. And for the speakers, we do have a little bit more cushion this time. So you can do a 10-minute talk with 3 minutes of questions. All right. Go for it, Nathan.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Kim, and all the organizers. All right. So I'm going to talk a little bit. Can you hear me? Okay. There we go. I'm going to talk a little bit about irrigation, climate, and land use. And why do we care about this intersection? This is a photo from our neighborhood in Colorado. You can see the snowpack that applies to irrigation. So irrigation matters because it disproportionately contributes to global food production. You've probably seen a stat like this: 20% of the area, but around 40% of the food production. Irrigation water supplies are also at risk in the changing climate. And irrigation itself is a very valuable climate change adaptation tool, right? So it increases yields overall, it increases your yield resilience, and it leads to local cooling through changes in the surface energy balance. All right, but the more we use irrigation as an adaptation tool, what's going to happen to emissions, right? So if we follow the arrows here, if we have more adaptation via irrigation, that leads to more energy use for pumping and altered biogeochemistry in the soil, leading to some unknown greenhouse gas emissions. So, there's this idea here, irrigation expansion could then therefore threaten irrigation itself. All right, so we looked at these different emissions pathways associated with irrigation, specifically fossil fuels for pumping and conveyance, increased N2O from elevated soil moisture, and then also groundwater CO2 degassing. Which is, if you have groundwater that becomes super saturated in CO2, you pump it up, it equilibrates with the atmosphere. All right, so as part of this, we developed a county-scale spatially explicit database of all these different emissions. So these are all costs associated with irrigation. But we wanted to stack that up against the benefits of irrigation, right? Irrigation allows us to produce more food on less land. And so before I turn this into a PDF, this was a nice little GIF. You can see the forest disappearing, so you just have to use your imagination. So there are land use benefits, but then you could also translate those land use benefits into climate benefits and think about climate costs and benefits of irrigation, which is where we're heading eventually with this work. But first, I want to go through at lightning speed all of those emissions pathways and what we did to quantify them. Here we have the on-farm pumping emissions. This is actually derived from fuel expenditure data from the USDA Irrigation Water Management Survey, and then we back out that to total consumption of the fuel and the associated emissions. It's a pretty decent number, over 12 million metric tons of CO2, and you can see that that color bar is on a log scale, so it's really highly concentrated in places like the Ogallala, the Central Valley, and the Mississippi Delta. All right, and if we look at this by fuel type, you can also see that a lot of it is coming from electricity use. Also, most of it is for groundwater extraction, which makes sense. It's very energy intensive. But the good thing about it being dominated by electricity is that there's decent decarbonization potential too. So this is on the right. Just if you look at the red, that would have been like a poor policy scenario. If you look all the way down at the open squares at the bottom, that's with current policy, plus an electrification scenario where we help farmers transition their pumps to electric. All right, so energy use for interbasin transfers. This is also a type of energy use for irrigation. When we pump water across watershed boundaries, that can take a lot of energy. So we use this new database out of Virginia Tech, and we basically contacted all the operators to get individual energy use data. It turns out that a good chunk, some of them actually don't use any energy. They use innovative engineering solutions to avoid that. But some do, and it's really dominated by just two projects, the Central Arizona Project and the California State Water Project. All right, we also looked at N2O from increased soil moisture. Here we did a statistical meta-model of the U.S. national greenhouse gas inventory and backed out the effect of irrigation on those emissions. So this is basically reanalyzing data output, which is a process-based biogeochemistry model, but we also did a simpler Tier 2 model that produced a fairly similar estimate. But the uncertainty is really large on this. All right, so now to our last pathway, degassing. And before I started this research, I didn't even realize this was an important flux, but it is. It's kind of interesting, and it really depends on the chemistry of the groundwater. So here we use USGS well water data to calculate those emissions, and it's really strongly concentrated in the Mississippi embayment because of the groundwater chemistry there. All right, so if you put all these different types of emissions up on the left, you can see how they sum together. In the context of all of our ag-related emissions, these irrigation-related emissions aren't huge, but on the other hand, we're still talking about the emissions of a small country, like I think it's comparable to the emissions of Costa Rica, for example. All right. So now we want to take those emissions and we want to stack them up against the land use benefits of irrigation. And eventually, as I mentioned, we want to get to the climate benefits. So to do that, we leveraged decades of paired county-level irrigated and rain-fed yield data coming from USDA. So there are enough counties where there's enough rain-fed production, enough irrigated production that they would report the survey results separately. And they seem to have stopped doing it that much recently, unfortunately, but there's enough there that we can train a random forest model and we can calculate these yield ratios. Unfortunately, it's a little hard to see the graphs on the bottom, but that's the production change without irrigation. I just want to call your attention to the biggest production loss would be for fruits and vegetables. I think it's like a 40% loss. All right, so how do we actually calculate these land use benefits of irrigation? We can go from a very naive approach to a more sophisticated approach. So the most naive approach would be, okay, you take away the irrigation, but then you try and grow those crops in the same locations, right? Which, for obvious reasons, will likely not happen. But you can use those irrigated and rain-fed yield ratios to do that. If we do that, we close to double the amount of land that's needed for this production. We're talking about the additional area of Wisconsin or Ecuador needed to produce the food if you were to replace it locally. All right, so calculation number 2 was, let's just say that food gets redistributed across the country relatively in proportion to where it is grown currently, including currently rain-fed areas. And so that decreases the area. So we're going from about to the area of Pennsylvania instead of Wisconsin. All right, calculation number 3, what if we actually try and do this in a more sophisticated way that takes into account, the agricultural economy and prices? That's where we're heading. We use these data to produce a production shock that we use as an input to GTAP. And then we're getting out from those model runs the amount of induced land use change. So just this hypothetical scenario of a world without U.S. irrigation, what would it look like? And that will allow us to, in a more sophisticated way, really stack up these costs and benefits of irrigation. All right, so just to wrap up, I just want to emphasize that A positive news story here is how much of these emissions can be decarbonized. Obviously, irrigation has a big production benefit, and this cost benefits framing allows us to kind of think about those, put those land use and climate benefits alongside the climate costs of irrigation. So, thanks.
Voilà. Thank you. Next one. Again. Any questions in the audience? I have one actually, but yeah, thank you. So you said the electricity was like the biggest source for the amount of pumping energy, right? So there's room for decarbonization. So I was wondering, how carbonized is the electricity currently? Do you have this information for your mind?
Like how carbon intensive is the grid?
Which fuel is used to produce electricity? Because we know sometimes it's coal. So
right. So yeah, we in those emissions trajectories, that's kind of taken into account. They come from the National Renewable Energy Lab, and we use their emissions factors for current day emissions associated with the grid, but then also how it's projected to change and get cleaner into the future based on current policy.
And do you have in mind the percentage of electricity that is low carbon?
That's a great question. I don't think it's particularly huge, but it is getting bigger and will continue to get bigger. So the kind of the general philosophy with some of this decarbonization is just try and electrify everything and then fix the grid, right? So that would be similar to like incentivizing heat pumps for housing instead of natural gas. Can we switch from natural gas and diesel to electricity here as well? Okay. Yeah. All right.
But it's the same question. So unless we have another question, I don't think so. You saw someone? Hi. Thank you.
Great talk. Do you think there's any need or value in increasing the resolution of those estimates, more spatially or temporally, or do we get all the insights we need to make action at the county scale?
Yeah, I think definitely temporally would be useful to understand the trends. We kind of did it opportunistically using recent data, but and some of the earlier surveys don't have quite all the data that we need to do it, if I remember right. But it would be great if some of the emissions happened. I think we could. Just the on-farm pumping might be hard. But spatially, definitely, I think that would be really useful because we want to know where these farmers are that are still using fossil fuel pumps and what are their constraints, right? So one of the constraints might be that these, like, if you have a big center pivot pump, maybe you need a 480 volt connection. And some of these rural electric systems, like, possibly may not be able to provide that. So, what else would you have to do to make it a reality? And if we knew where it was specifically, then we could do a better job of that. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you again. So the next speaker is Shefang. She will talk about stakeholder priorities and sustainability trade-offs for cereal production in Northeast China. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Shefang. I'm a postdoctor from the Chinese Academy of Agricultural Science. And today my topic is about the conflicting stakeholders' priorities, produce and sustainability trade-offs for cereal production in Northeast China. And actually, provide accessible and nutritious food while reducing the environmental burdens is one of the main objectives of SDG. And as some scholars mentioned in this morning, crop switching is also one of the promising way to achieve the sustainable agriculture. And lots of studies produced in US, China, India, and even the globe, it shows that the crop switching can achieve the decrease of environmental cost while not the compromise of crop production. And actually, the implementation of crop switching needs to consider the stakeholders, the priorities of the different stakeholders. And actually, for different stakeholders, the priority is different, such as for the agriculture from the policymakers of the agriculture sectors, probably the mainly focus on how could we increase the crop yield while reducing the fertilizer input. But for the water resource sectors, they want to know how to reduce the water use, especially for the irrigation water use. And this kind of difference lead to the mismatched crop choices for different stakeholders. So that is why we need to do such kind of analysis. So in this part, we take Northeast China as a case study. We want to assess the sustainability scenarios and trade-offs among a subset of sustainable agriculture objectives, such as the nutritional supply and the water consumption and greenhouse gas emission. And from a farmer's perspective, we want to include the profit. And actually, we analyze the nutritional supply and water consumption and greenhouse gas emissions from the zero production per hectare, and then we make the synergy and trade-off analysis for the different zeros and also for the choices of the different stakeholders. And we'll aim to find some gaps between the crop choices between different stakeholders. And so why is Northeast China? Actually, this region is one of the main production of cereal in China. It provides 20% of the cereal production. Actually, the predominant cereals are rice and maize. And however, in the past decades, the crop shifts a lot from especially for rice, experienced a huge expansion from dryland cereals. And such kind of huge dynamics contributed to the groundwater overuse in some of the region. And so we want to do such kind of analysis at the county level. And from the 2010-2014, this is the most available data we can obtain. And so I want to notice that the nutritional yield is different with the traditional yield. We calculate how many adults can be attained 100% of the recommended daily dietary reference intake from even zero production on 1 hectare. And the results show that so this is the nutritional yield, water consumption, and greenhouse gas emission, especially for the irrigation water. And it shows that rice has the highest micronutrient supply, such as for energy supply and protein supply, but with the highest environmental cost, such as the blue water consumption of rice is much higher. It's higher than about 6 to 14 times than other dryland cereals. And for greenhouse gas emissions, the rice are about 5 times of other dryland cereals. Okay, so it shows some spatial heterogeneities. So about the profits from a farmer's perspective, it shows that rice shows is the most valuable cereal for farmers. This is because the relatively high price and also the yields. But actually, when we see the price of the yield, we find that the highest price is from the millet. It's 2 times of rice. But when we include the yield, we found that rice is more than millet, much more. So this is because the lower yield of millet, and this kind of low situations also happen to other dryland cereals such as wheat and maybe sorghum. If we plot all of these dimensions in one picture, we show that no single. So this picture shows the mean value of the whole region. It shows that no single cereals can meet all objectives of the sustainable development. For rice, it can provide a lot of energy and protein yield, but with the most share of the iron yield and also irrigation water consumption, greenhouse gas emissions. And for other dryland cereals, the best choices is maize, and except that the millet and some such kind of coarse cereals can provide more iron yield, but also with the lowest water consumption and greenhouse gas emissions. Because of the lower yield, so it's not the best choices for the farmers. So if we plot it spatially, and we found that this is the results from the policymakers. And if we want to meet all of the objectives for the policymakers, we found that based on current situations, and only 13% of regions can achieve all objectives for policymakers by choosing sorghum, maize, and millet. And most of the regions exist lots of trade-offs. And so this picture shows the farmers' choices. And it shows that rice is, in most of the regions, rice is the best choices. Okay, so when we include all of the stakeholders' priority, we found that there are only 2% of regions that can achieve the sustainable agriculture by choosing millet, sorghum, and maize. So here's some take-home messages, and we found that if we make some policies at the whole region, and no single cereals can meet all of the objectives. But if we switch rice to some dryland cereals, we can decrease the irrigation water by almost 89% per hectare. But with some minor compromise in micro energy nutrition yield, and also the benefits. And for the policymakers, the best of the choices is maize and sorghum. But this is not the target cereals for farmers because of the lower profits. And based on this kind of results, we found that some policy incentives are needed to make, such as to improve the yield of target cereals, such as millet, with a higher price but lower yields. And also we need to build a comprehensive price system, since current price protective system just for rice and maize. And lastly, we also noticed that the incentives in diet sheets can motivate some of the market preference changes. So it will give some feedbacks to the producer side to change the crop switching. Yeah. So, thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Jipeng. Any question for the speaker? Trade-offs? I also have a question, but okay. It's digestion time.
We should be studying coffee right now. Okay, so all of these things are about nutrition and price, but I'm curious where these crops are consumed. Are they going to other parts of China? Are they consumed locally? And what are people's, how hard is it to cook and store and handle it, and how delicious is it compared to the other things, right? So sort of what's the the cultural preference for the food that people are eating, and also where is the food going, right? Where are these grains going? Are they being consumed locally, or are they being consumed elsewhere?
Okay, thank you, Kim. Actually, in this study, we just focus on the cereals planted not in recently, but also in history. So actually, for millet and sorghum is some traditional nutritious food for especially for North China, and but actually the taste of sorghum is not so well. It's not well done right and wheat. And another reason is that with the improvement of income, people want to with more choices. I guess it's really hard to change the preference of consumers, but it's not impossible since all of these cereals are traditional foods, and we still have such kind of culture, especially for the elder people. They are more acceptance for the elder people. So yeah, but it's really hard to change the preference. Yeah.
Thank you. I think, there's a small question that I didn't see.
Okay, so next we have Chiang-kun with a flash talk, so pay attention.
Head fast.
Hello everyone, my name is Chiang-kun Liu. Today I'm going to sharing our recent work about assessing global suitability of transitions from single to multiple cropping. Adoption of multiple cropping is a quite important strategy to achieve sustainable crop intensification, but the potential remains slightly studied. So, to fill this gap, we proposed two research questions. First, what makes multiple cropping successful? And the second is which regions have the highest suitability for adopting multiple cropping systems? And then we used XGBoost and K-means clustering for 25 variables to answer the question. And I think it doesn't show properly, but anyway, and here are part of the results. And as you can see, the first three colors for agriculture, climate, and economy, they contribute largely to both cropping systems. And if you look at the purple one, the water availability they might more in green-fied crops and especially in multiple cropping. And for the green one, the economy variables, they contribute more in irrigated crops and especially in single cropping. These patterns are easy to interpret. As green-fied crops, they rely largely on the precipitation, and multiple cropping, they need more water to extend the growing season. And for the economic variables, then the adoption of multiple cropping, it can reduce the economic vulnerability by increase the crop in diversification. And let's look at some special maps of suitability. And for the first two, you can see the maize, the US and the Europe. They have a moderate suitability of transitions to multiple cropping from current single cropping. And some regions in China, they have a higher suitability of these transitions. Because these, the US, Europe, and China, they are the perfect mix of soil climate and water and agriculture conditions. But compared to the maize, wheat only have limited areas for we only have a limited area. We are suitable for this transition. Okay, that's it. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Changkun. We have time for one or two questions. Multiple cropping. Still digesting. Okay, Kim is still awake.
Trying to stay awake. Thank you so much for that talk. So you showed the figure with the rain-fed wheat, and it shows high probability for being able to do multiple crops in like the northern United States and southern Canada. Is that really possible within a single growing, like a single summertime? You could do 2 wheat crops. What is it? How would you plant 2 wheat crops? Do you do a winter wheat and then a summer wheat? Is that the
It's actually based on the multiple cropping distribution data, so they have different multiple cropping for wheat and maize. So it's not a specific crop after one specific crop. So they combine the different crops, like maize and wheat, and maize and soybean, let's say. And so it's not one single result.
Thank you. Thank you.
We have time for one more question. Then can I ask a question? It's also on the maps where you showed it was rain-fed maize in France and other parts of Europe around that. I was curious about the limitation in terms of water availability, precipitation, and high temperature. Would maize do okay as rain-fed crop in that region?
Yes, but actually these maps they are produced by the historical data in the year of 2000. So for now, we can say that the temperature is increasing and they are not suitable for multiple cropping in the future, but for the historical data, yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you again.
Thank you.
So next we have Lola.
I'm going to tell you is actually a very positive story. So I think we need that sometimes. Because what we found in this study that was that we see joint environmental and social benefits of diversified agriculture. And I should say that this study was done together with 58 co-authors, who are also many of them are here during this conference. So it was really a team effort. Okay, so why did we do this study? We basically wanted to look into an alternative to industrialized agriculture. And we wanted to try to see if we somehow could harmonize all the existing data sets out there. So each of us knew that there were some sort of separate data sets, and we thought it would be a fun exercise to try to see if we could bring all these together. So we had 3 sort of broad inclusion criteria for whether a data set would fit into this exercise. And the first one was that it should have measured at least what we call one diversification practice. And it should measure sort of like a gradient of diversification. So it wouldn't basically work if all farms in a given data set had exactly the same amount of diversification, then there wouldn't be anything for us to measure on. So there should be this gradient of diversification, and ideally there should be some control farms where they had absolutely no diversification. Then the second criteria was that this data set should have measured at least one environmental variable, and then the third data set was that it should have measured at least one more social or socioeconomic variable. And this whole thing ended up with 24 data sets, and that represented 2,655 farms. And I should say that in the beginning it was a little bit of a painful exercise to actually get these different data sets. And I think it was because it was slightly unclear to people what we were actually trying to do. But then we kind of reached a turning point where people sort of started to see the point of this, and then it turned from me sort of like emailing around to try to get people to contribute their data sets to actually then people sort of like emailing me and saying, okay, we have this data set, will it potentially fit into what you're trying to do? So that was really sort of reassuring. I should also say that I think what really stands out from our approach compared to more standard meta-analysis is that we decided from day one that all data contributors should be heavily involved in the analysis, both in the design of the actual research and then also when we would run our sort of pooled models, then they should have the say in the validation. We would run separate models for some of the data sets to get a sense of whether our modeling approach actually made sense in these different contexts. And when I say different contexts, then this is to give you a sense of why it was so important to us to actually have a sense of why or whether our models made sense. Because we had really, really different data sets. So we had, for example, blueberry farming in Canada, we had strawberry farming in the US, we had winter wheat in Germany, we had rubber and oil palm in Indonesia. We had many studies also from Africa, where it was, for example, agroforestry with cocoa and agroforestry with coffee in Ethiopia. We had smallholder maize in Malawi. So just to give you a sense of a lot of really, really different data sets. Okay. This is also just to give you a sense of this diversification gradient I was talking about before. So here you see our strawberry data sets from California. On the left side, you see strawberry monoculture, and then we have on the right side also farms included where it's a much more diversified strawberry system with these flower strips in between the strawberries. Okay, so what do I mean when I say diversification? We wanted to go way beyond just talking about crop diversification. So we worked with these 4 or 5 broad types of diversification strategies. So the strategies are the 5 broad types, and then under each strategy we work with what I call practices, so diversification practices. So the first broad diversification strategy, that was the usual temporal crop diversification, and then we would, for example, look at crop rotation. Then we also had non-crop diversification, and then it could, for example, be whether there would be flower strips on the farm or hedgerows or things like that. Then we had soil conservation. Then it could be, for example, whether farmers were incorporating their residues. Then the 4th type was water conservation. So we would look at, for example, whether contour farming was in place on the farm. And then finally, it was also very important for us to have livestock diversification, and then we would count the number of livestock species. So these 5 broad types. So how on earth did we score each of these more than 2,600 farms in the data set? So for each single, and now I say field, because if a given farm had multiple fields, then we would score this for each field. And here I give you an example with the non-crop diversification. So for each field, then we would look basically at the presence or the absence of 6 different of these practices, diversification practices, under the broad umbrella of non-crop diversification. So it could basically be hedgerows, windbreaks, flower strips, beetle banks, forest strips, and then other sort of non-crop diversification practices. So each field would basically have a score from 0 to 6. And that was how we did for all the broad 5 strategies. Okay, so that was the diversification side of it. Then now I move to the outcome side of it. So for the environmental outcomes, then first we would look at biodiversity, and then it could, for example, be the richness of a bird or bees or beetles, depending on what made sense in the given context. Then we also looked at ecosystem services, and then very common things to measure here would be the soil carbon stocks, or pest damage, or flood control, or things like that. And then we had one third category that we called reduced externalities. So it was basically whether the farmers applied chemical pesticides or synthetic fertilizers on each field. Then on the social side, then we had food security, and I should say here that it was very important for us that we never dictated how people should actually measure it. So if, for example, some data contributors had measured this as food expenditures, then we included that. If they had measured as dietary diversity scores, then we included that. If they had measured as like number of months in a given year without food, then we also included that. So we included everything people had measured. Then for human well-being, we wanted to go well beyond income. So we looked at 20 different subcategories, including, for example, mental health and labor requirements. And then finally, of course, we had yields. Okay, so now to what I consider the key results. And that is this positive thing that more diversification strategies or practices are basically better. So on the left side, you see our models for the number of strategies modeled, and then the G is the number of practices, so these subcategories. On the outer circle of the black circle you have in here, then it's the positive effects, and on the inner side of the circle, then it would be the negative effects. But what I want to direct your attention to is especially the red one, where we see very positive effects for biodiversity. And then also, if you look at the light blue one, then we see very positive effects for food security. And it's important to note also that we do not see any yield losses. Often it is claimed that, we should not diversify because people lose out on their yields. That's not what we see. We do not see yield increases, but we do not see yield losses. Okay, so after we published this study, then one question I've often been asked is how on earth is it possible that diversification can bring about food security when yields do not increase? And that actually makes very good sense to me, even though it's somehow counterintuitive, because if you, for example, measure food security as dietary diversity score, then if you, for example, have trees on your farm with mango and papaya and so on, then that will really contribute to your dietary diversity score, even though you do not see yield increases for example, the maize you have on your field. Okay, so then we now know that we have positive effects for biodiversity and for food security, and then we basically wanted to look into whether these things come at the same time. And then, if you look at the bottom here, then the black ones are the win-wins. That's where we see the positive effects for both biodiversity and food security. So it's not like a subset where we see food security positive effects and a subset with positive effects for biodiversity. We do actually see these win-wins. So to wrap up, then the big question is, what will it then take for farmers to actually start diversifying even more? And then I basically think that a new way of thinking is needed. So often development initiatives have promoted simplified agriculture, but we really need to now promote diversified agriculture. This will, however, require financial support. It won't happen without that. And it will also require labor and access to training and knowledge and land and seeds and so on. But I think there are very important lessons to be learned from places where it has worked out. So, for example, Ghana and Malawi, where we see that it's really about the social networks where farmers can learn from one another and see what is really working. So, on that note, thank you very much. And if you want to read more about the paper, the references here.
Thank you, Laura. It's so nice to hear some win-wins for once and not just trade-offs. Any questions for Laura on the diversification benefits?
Thanks very much. I noticed that you don't include any case from Mexico. And I wanted to know why, because there are several production systems that are based on a multiple diversification.
Yeah. So it's a good question. So for example, we don't have any studies from Denmark. So it's really all dependent on whether the different data sets lived up to these three inclusion criteria that we had. I will say I did not go into specific countries sort of to say, okay, we really need to represent Mexico or we need to represent Denmark. So it might have been a little bit biased in terms of also the sort of researchers in my network and the people we reached out to. But I did not sort of exclude any data set from Mexico on purpose.
Thank you. There's another question. Short questions, I'm told.
I want to know about the machinization after the increase of diversity. Just like that, if we crop just one, if we just plant one crop, and maybe it's easier to harvest or to plant it using machine. But if we increase the diversity of the crops, just plant 2 or 3 crops in one field, maybe it's not easier to or maybe we need more labor first. Is that? So I think I want to know the trade-offs between the machinization and the labor first inputs before and after the increase of crop diversity.
Yeah. I think that's a very good question because you actually touched upon one of the big knowledge gaps we also identified with this work, and that is that it was not a whole lot of data sets that measured the labor requirements of the different diversification practices. So we had a few data sets that did that, but I think in order for diversification to really sort of be aspirational to farmers, then they need to know, okay, what exactly is needed in terms of labor for applying different diversification practices, and which diversification practices can be applied with the existing sort of machine park that they have. So I think that there's a lot more work to be done on that, and we didn't get to the bottom of that.
Thank you so much, Joanna. So we are going to have another flash talk now from Kayla. Is it the right pronunciation? Kayla is a PhD student in Edinburgh, and we will be hearing from her about Mexican dietary guidelines and how to adhere to that with different policies. Thanks, Kayla. So that's 3 minutes. Should be on. It's on? Yeah.
Oh, hi everyone. My name is Kayla, and I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Edinburgh. I'm coming from a public health background, so focusing more on the consumption side rather than production. But thank you for having me all today, and I welcome a diversity of perspectives. And so broadly, my PhD work focuses on transition to sustainable and healthy food systems in Mexico, with a particular focus on dietary targets for red and processed meat. So I'll be presenting on promoting adherence to these dietary targets through attacks on red and processed meat. And so what really motivated this research question in the Mexican context? The first is that Mexico has a substantial burden of diet-related chronic disease. And to address this, Mexico was one of the first countries in 2014 to pass a tax on junk food and sugar-sweetened beverages, and has since been regarded as a leader in food policy. And also, the current food system in Mexico is producing negative environmental impacts. And recognizing this, public health officials and the government of Mexico designed sustainable Mexican dietary guidelines, but has found that there is low adherence to these guidelines in what the population is currently consuming, particularly for red and processed meat dietary targets. And so with my colleagues at el Instituto Nacional de Salud Pública, I have a long-standing relationship with them, given I worked there for a few years prior to my master's. And so through conversations with them, they're interested in exploring government-supported price increases to red and processed meat to help accelerate these transitions to sustainable food systems, particularly since taxes are one of the most effective and cost-effective policy options that we have for altering consumer behavior. And so this is going to be a very rapid-fire approach to what I did, but I looked at data from the Mexican National Income and Expenditure Survey, which is a nationally representative survey that collects information on household expenditures as reported by the head of household over the past 7 days. I used the most 3 recent rounds available. And then I modeled the Mexican food demand system through a pretty traditional economic model called the almost ideal demand system to give me an idea of what would be the relationship between price and demand for red and processed meat, but also with other food groups in the Mexican demand system to understand dietary substitutes and complements. And then I looked at these 4 price increase scenarios, and I'm going to focus on these 2. They all came from the meat tax literature. The first was a price increase of 30% to both red and processed meat. And the last was the most extreme example, which would be a 100% price increase to processed meat, given its more deleterious health effects, particularly with its association with colorectal cancer. And so this is what I got. So essentially using the price elasticities, I'm just showing you quickly the outcomes of these 4 demand scenarios, and these are the changes in percent quantity demanded for each of the food groups. Here are the other food groups I mentioned that I modeled in the demand system, so dairy, eggs, discretionary foods, which is salt and sweet snacks or sugar-sweetened beverages, seafood, fruits and vegetables, grains, beans, poultry, etc. And so if we were to look at the example of scenario 1, where a 30% price increase was applied to both red and processed meat, you can see that in fruits and vegetables, it resulted in the largest increase in demand for those foods, and also the largest decrease in demand for discretionary foods. But then, for example, the last scenario, which was the more extreme example, we saw that obviously it resulted in the greatest decline in demand for processed meat, but also the largest increase in demand for beans and seafood. And so what I really think is important in this slide is to not just look at how we're reducing demand for red and processed meat, but also the implications that it has for the rest of the diet, which can affect health and dietary quality, but also the environment. And I just wanted to quickly thank all of my wonderful colleagues that I have at El Instituto and my supervisors at the University of Edinburgh, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kayla. That's very interesting. How to say 4 minutes. So I think Peter, there's a quick question. Yeah. Well, we have minus 1 minute.
Can I ask you if it's not quick?
Yeah.
Okay. So a lot of countries have tried taxing, foods that are bad for human health and bad for the environment, and that I know of, we've never seen any of those effects ripple through to human health data. So we don't see improved health, because if you tax food that's bad for you, people tend to spend their money on other food that's bad for you, rather that's good for you. And so while I can certainly see the case for an environmental benefit, because meat is, of course, the most environmentally damaging, do you expect human health benefit from this?
Yeah, I think that was a major priority of this work, would be to look at the dietary substitutes and complements. And so, for example, if you place a larger tax on processed meat, it is a strong dietary substitute for beans. So theoretically, according to the economic model, the consumption of beans would increase in the Mexican adult population. Whether that actually occurs in practice, we'll have to see, but what would really be ideal is if we had some longitudinal dietary consumption data where we can actually understand these dietary substitution and complement behaviors. But, yeah.
Thank you. We go to the next one. So the next speaker is Neus Escobar, and she will tell us about AgroScan with the microphone that works. Yes, thank you. Global Agri-Systems with a new MRIO database.
Thanks. So good afternoon. Thanks for having me. So yes, I'm Neus Escobar from the Basque Center for Climate Change in the north of Spain. And today I will present AgroScan, which is a new multi-regional input-output database to assess the connections across global agri-food supply chains. So we all know that international trade in agri-food has been increasing steadily in the last decades. For instance, global agricultural exports have increased threefold in value since 2005. And accordingly, the ratio of imports over production in global agri-food commodities has been also increasing. And nowadays, international trade is considered a driver of impacts such as deforestation, land use change, or biodiversity loss. So this generates the so-called environmental footprints that measure impacts embodied in the final demand of the agri-food that we consume. But it's not very easy to measure these footprints because supply chains are increasingly complex and interlinked. Multi-regional input-output analysis already provides a robust framework to measure these consumption-driven footprints because these databases trace product flows between countries and sectors. They can be either monetary, physical, or hybrid, depending on the units of these flows. And in the literature, these kind of models have been used widely to estimate, for instance, resource footprints, such as material, energy, or land footprints, but also other footprints when coupled to environmental extensions. The problem is that results are determined by or limited by the number of sectors that these models have. Because, for instance, if we estimate the footprint of the commodity grains, this means that all grains will have the same footprint, even though they have very different yields, for instance. So in general, the more sectors we have, the better for environmental footprint analysis. So this presentation is going to focus on presenting AgroScan, which is a physical multi-regional MRIO database. Otherwise, I will not need the time. For agri-food, and it's entirely based on Eurostat data, both publicly and non-publicly data sources. It's a result of long-term collaboration with the Statistics Division of FAO. The methodology is currently under review, and the presentation will focus on the construction of AgroScan in general, and I will highlight some applications of the model. The database is built or is based on conventional input-output techniques. Input-output tables are typically based on national accounts and expressed in monetary units, and these are commonly used to assess interdependencies or the structure of national economies. For instance, to assess how many jobs are required in Mexico to satisfy the demand of cars in Mexico, including all the jobs along the supply chain. National input-output tables can be combined using bilateral trade data into a multi-regional input-output framework to describe global supply chains. And with this, we can answer questions such as how many jobs are required in Spain to satisfy the demand for cars in Mexico, including jobs in other sectors. So the idea is that we do the same, but using Eurostat data to build an MRIO of agri-food commodities. So this is the overview of the construction of AgroScan. The main data source is the supply utilization accounts, the SUAs that provide data on production, uses, demand across several uses, stock change, losses, processing, import, and exports of 640 products across 181 countries. The problem is that the SUAs tell us how much is going into processing, but not into what. So we need to use other data such as the commodity trees or extraction rates to really trace the supply chain to see what derivatives are obtained from each input. And then we also need to use detailed trade matrices to link the imports and exports from the partner countries into this multi-regional input-output framework. And then we also use extensions with harvested areas, calories, and for instance, greenhouse gas emissions. So the current AgroScan model traces agri-food supply chains from 2013 to 2020. And we are going to update it with the latest source. So this is just very briefly how, for instance, the global MRIO database will look for cocoa derivatives according to the commodity tree provided by FAO. So the general idea is that in rows we have the products that are becoming inputs to the sectors that we have in the columns, and also we have the demand for feed, food, non-food uses, and also losses. And we have been working with the livestock division of FAO to develop the environmental extensions for greenhouse gas emissions associated with primary crop production and their life cycle assessment approaches. And I will just show you some results to illustrate part of the potential of the model. For instance, to estimate cropland footprints of cocoa derivatives in 2020, because we know where cocoa was harvested, and for instance, we also know what countries are providing the cocoa beans that are ultimately consumed in the destination countries, not only as food, but also, for instance, for energy, based on the husks and shells. And with this, we are able to trace the virtual flows, for instance, in this example, flowing from Côte d'Ivoire to the consumer countries. And we can see clearly how land is virtually, the land embodied in these cocoa beans is virtually flowing to the northern hemisphere. And with this, we are able to estimate cropland footprints of the consumer countries. With no surprise, the largest footprints are obtained for the US, UK, Germany, Netherlands, but when we estimate them per capita, then we get the largest footprints for countries such as Switzerland or Iceland. Then another application was to assess calorie footprints embedded in the final demand for food and feed. In this case, it's crop-based food. And of course, again, in absolute values, we see that China has the largest footprint in terms of calories embodied in those primary crops ultimately consumed for food and feed. But for instance, we see tradeoffs such as the US is using more calories to satisfy its demand for feed than for crop-based food, and it's the opposite for countries such as India. We also use this to assess the calorie import dependency on exports from Ukraine and Russia. In 2020, for example, this is the example, and we see that countries in the Mediterranean, Africa, and Eastern Europe are more dependent on calories exported from Ukraine and Russia, which makes them more vulnerable to supply chain disruptions. And the last application was to estimate the carbon footprints of the feed, because this is an ongoing collaboration with the livestock division of FAO. So we were able to estimate the footprint of the feed in absolute numbers, but this figure shows results per ton of feed. And we also obtained somehow surprising results, because we saw that countries that are using broken rice as a residue from rice processing, such as Gambia, Myanmar, and also Madagascar, they have the largest footprint per ton of feed, considering all the items used for feed globally that our model considers more than 170 items used for feed. So this is the conclusion, because I wanted to do it in minutes. So I have presented AgroScan, because it's an MRI database that it traces product flows, well, not only flows, traces flows of product, land, greenhouse gas emission, and also calories throughout agri-food supply chains in greater detail than any other similar tool. When we will update it with the latest SWA, we will cover 650 products in 193 countries. For now, the flows of products are traced up to the stage in which they are consumed as food, feed, seed, or non-food uses, which means that still we are not linking the feed to the animal sectors and ultimately the animal-derived products. And this is what we are doing also with the livestock division. We are developing a model to trace this feed, to link this feed to the ultimate sectors that use the feed, and with this we will estimate the footprints of animal-derived products as well. And of course, you can imagine this has many applications. For instance, we can use it to estimate other footprints, such as biodiversity, water, etc. It can provide data to enrich lifecycle inventories or also for integrated assessment models. And most importantly, for this audience, it's a tool for supply chain transparency to inform more targeted interventions because it provides information on environmental hotspots, also import dependencies, and also sustainable sourcing, for instance, or we will also use it to assess the drivers of agricultural land expansion and ultimately deforestation. So thank you very much. If you have questions.